Welcome to the Wisconsin Logging Museum's virtual tour. My name's Mike and I'll be your guide. Today we're going to learn about the history of Wisconsin's logging. We'll visit the Paul Bunyan Logging Camp, an authentic 1890s logging camp replica, and we'll talk about how Wisconsin's logging industry fit into the larger narrative of American history during the late 19th century. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's get started. The story of Wisconsin's forests begins over 12,000 years ago, when glaciers over a mile thick receded, leaving behind the perfect environment for white pine. Over the centuries, this landscape would be turned into a lumberman's dream. A forest with white pine trees stretching over 200 feet into the air, and a network of rivers to float them to market. The lumber from these white pines was odorless, strong, slow to rot, easy to work, and light enough to float down the rivers of Wisconsin and on to markets around the country. During the 1800s, America was growing. New cities, bridges, and railroads were being built across the Great Plains, creating demand for lumber. Great Lakes white pine from Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin offered an ideal building material for the growing nation's needs, and so the United States government purchased northern Wisconsin through treaties with 4 nations. At the time, the United States did not explain these treaties very well. In some cases, the tribes believed they were simply leasing the land to the U.S. government to harvest the timber. Through 4 treaties with the Ojibwe, Menominee, and Dakota nations in 1837 through 1842, the United States government purchased the Northwoods of Wisconsin. In the end, for every dollar worth of lumber in these lands, the Native American tribes received 1/3 of a penny. Once the U.S. government had purchased the Northwoods, it could be sold. This started the logging era in Wisconsin, which ran from the 1840s until 1910s. On average, the price to buy 1 acre of Wisconsin timberland was $1.25, or about $30 in 2020. This cheap land and the promise of wealth drew men looking to cash in on the bounty of the Northwoods. These men, who would make their fortunes in timber, were called lumber barons. Lumber companies owned by barons would build logging camps on their newly bought land. A logging camp was built during the summer and used for 1 season before being abandoned. In this 1 season, the lumberjacks were expected to clear all the trees in the area. Because dragging logs through the forest is almost impossible without modern equipment, the camps ran from November through mid-March, using the snow, ice roads, and sleds to move the logs to the riverbanks more easily, where they waited for the spring floods to float the timber to mills. Regardless of who ran the company, the basic principles of lumbering were the same. Trees were cut down in the early days by axe and later by saw. The branches and limbs were removed, and the trees were sawn into 16-foot logs. These logs were then hauled with sleds to the banks of a river. In the spring, the trees were floated downriver to the mills, where they were held in ponds until they could be processed into goods or lumber. There were many different jobs in the lumber camps, and the pay reflected the level of skill and danger involved in the work. 2 of these jobs, swampers and sawyers, are what most people probably think of as lumberjacks today. Sawyers worked in teams of 2, using large saws to cut down the trees. Then swampers, also known as axemen, came in and removed the tree's branches and limbs, using axes. Once the limbs were removed, the sawyers returned and cut the trees into 16-foot logs. But there were many other jobs in the lumber camp. Some men worked with teams of animals pulling sleds full of logs on ice roads. Most camps had a blacksmith, and some had a carpenter. Some men, called loaders, had the dangerous work of stacking the logs into piles along the river. The work was incredibly dangerous, and injury and even death was not uncommon. Some men claimed they never saw the camp during the day. They worked Monday through Saturday, waking up at 4 a.m. Breakfast was 20 minutes in the cook shanty, and then it was a 1 to 3 mile walk to the work site called the push. Lunch was served in the woods, and the men had 30 minutes to eat and smoke. At 7 p.m. they walked back to camp for dinner at 8. If there was work the next day, it was lights out by 9. Now that we have a little background on the logging industry, I want you to imagine that it's early November in 1890. We've just walked 30 miles through the woods from the nearest town to the Paul Bunyan Logging Camp, where we hope to become one of the over 28,000 men working in the woods of northern Wisconsin this winter. Now, some camps are as large as 100 men, some are as small as 20. Paul Bunyan's a medium-sized camp of 35 jacks. All right, let's go check it out. We start our tour where the jacks started and ended each day, the bunkhouse. The lumberjacks slept 2 men in each bed, with mattresses made of straw and branches of pine needles with blankets stacked on top. Lice, bed bugs, and ticks were common in the bunks. Men regularly had to burn their mattresses and boil their blankets to keep outbreaks under control. Most of the men bathed once a month, and it was not uncommon to go an entire season without bathing. After a day's work, they would hang their wet clothes around the bunkhouse to dry. Take a second to imagine what it must have smelt like by the end of the season. On Saturday nights, the men were allowed to stay up late, and the bunkhouse became a social club of sorts. Men played checkers and cards, but most importantly music. For every 10 lumberjacks, 6 of them were not born in America in the 1890s. Lumberjacks were often young men looking for employment in America from countries such as Ireland, France, Poland, Germany, Scandinavia, Finland, and Canada. It was not uncommon for 5 languages to be spoken in a single camp. Often music was the only common language. Accordions and mouth harps were common, but the lumber camps had a saying that the fiddler was as necessary as the teamster. Now let's follow the lumberjacks through their day to the cook shanty for breakfast. Welcome to the cook shanty, where the men will eat dinner and breakfast each day during the season. While at camp, every meal is provided for the men. Cooks worked long hours, and to make their jobs easier, as well as not waste food, the cook shanty had rules. First, seats were assigned for the season. Second, you could have as much food as you wanted, but what you didn't finish would be waiting on your plate for when you got back for the next meal. There was no talking during meals. Food was served for 20 minutes, and if you were talking, you weren't eating. Such long days took a lot of energy, and the average lumberjack needed to eat as many calories in one day as an adult today would eat in 2 to 3 days. The cook was in charge of making sure the food was good and the camp didn't run out of supplies. Sleds of goods arrived to the camp every 2 weeks, and if the cooks didn't order enough food, or the food was bad, the men might leave. There was no fresh fruit or vegetables served at the camp. Beans were served at least once a day, and tea or coffee was served with every meal. The cooks and their helpers, called bull cooks or cookies, would sleep in the cook's shanty, so they could be up early enough to have breakfast ready when the jacks woke up. Cooks and cooks' assistants were also the only job that women were allowed to have in the camps. Because of the long hours and skill needed, cooks made more than all the men except for the foreman who runs the camp. Cooks were paid $2 a day, which would be worth $49 in 2020. Our next stop will be the dentist's office or filer's shanty. Welcome to the filer's shanty, or dentist's office. Now, our dentist doesn't work on people's teeth, he works on saws' teeth. For each 2-man team of sawyers, 2 saws were used throughout the day. First, a light felling saw, which cut across a still standing tree to make it fall. And then once the tree was down, they came back with one of these heavy, thick bucking saws to turn it into logs. Now, each of these saws has between 150 and 250 teeth. So keeping them sharp is a full-time job, and that's what the dentist did. For each set of sawyers, there were 2 sets of saws, one out in the woods and one back in the dentist's office. Because the sharper the saws were, the faster they chopped down trees, and the more money they made throughout the season. All right, I think it's time we better check in with the boss. So let's head over to the foreman's office. Welcome to the foreman's office, sometimes called the push. We call him that because it's his job to push the men to fill the contract for the season. The foreman was in charge of the entire camp. He hired the men at the beginning of the season, he paid them at the end, and if there was trouble, he made sure it stopped. He also kept track of the books. The foreman was one of the few men on camp that had to be able to read, write, and do math. And at a camp the size of Paul Bunyan, that meant he was also probably in charge of the Wannegener store. Now the foreman had to keep a lot of things in mind. If it became too cold, the animals couldn't go out. At 20 below zero, it's unsafe to work horses or oxen outside. So he had a thermometer, but he kept it secret because the men would still have to work. And the foreman knew that if it was cold, and the men knew the temperature, they would waste time complaining about how cold it was. Whereas if they didn't know how cold, they didn't know the actual temperature, they would just complain about it being cold, which would take less time. The foreman is the highest paid man on site because he has to be able to read and write, and success for the entire season falls on his shoulders. Because he keeps track of the books, he also sleeps in his own room. Seniority has its privilege.
The final stop on our tour is the Wanigan.
Welcome to the Wanigan, or camp store. This was the only store open to the men during the season, and it was run by the camp, so the prices were high, but you'd be surprised what you could find here. Everything from medicine to shoes to shirts, even the odd musical instrument could be bought at a Wanigan. The Wanigan was also the post office. Mail came in and out every 2 weeks. Now, when you wanted to buy something at the Wanigan, you didn't need money. Lumberjacks didn't carry money. Instead, they were paid at the end of the season, and so if you made any purchases here, the amount of the goods that you bought was just taken out of your paycheck at the end of the season.
All through the winter season, logs were carefully piled by the banks of rivers, waiting for the snowmelt and spring floods. At this time, most of the men were given pay tickets. The men were paid out of the profits from the sale of the lumber. So, while they were issued checks, they were not valid until the wood had been processed and sold that October. If the men needed money before then, they could sell their tickets, but would not receive the full value for their season's work. While most of the jacks were done for the season, the logs still had a long way to go. It was time to send the logs downriver in the spring floods with a log drive. Once a log drive started, there was no stopping it until all the lumber had reached the mill. There was no more dangerous job in the Northwoods than working a log drive. While some of the work could be done from boats called bateaux, much of the time men had to run on top of logs floating in the icy waters of Wisconsin's rivers, where one mistake promised a dip in Wisconsin's icy waters, but could also lead to injury being smashed between logs floating down the river. These men went by many names. River Rat, River Pig, and Log Driver were among the most famous titles bestowed on these quick-footed men. The rivers of Wisconsin were not designed to carry logs. Rapids, sharp turns, and back creeks were a few of the threats waiting to snare logs. If one log got stuck, it could easily cause a pileup. This was called a log jam. Log jams were incredibly dangerous and could spell disaster for a driving crew. Jams caused a backup of water and unleashed catastrophic floods when they broke. If the jam got too large, logs might be stranded until the next season, which meant no one got paid for the entire year's work. Log jams could stack 30 feet high and stretch for over a mile. When they occurred, the crew would try to locate and remove the key log, which would unlock the jam and get the logs moving. For large jams, dynamite would be placed to try to blow the logs apart. This was the most dangerous job in logging, and when a jam broke, the crew was lucky to escape with their lives. Log drivers earned as much as $5 a day, which in 2020 would be worth $122. It may be hard to imagine, but in 1889, 23 million logs floated down the Chippewa River. That means for every 6 trees chopped down in America that year, one of them floated down the Chippewa River. Along the rivers, mills were built to process the logs into lumber or consumer goods, including shingles, barrels, or crates. These mills created jobs, causing small villages to have population booms. Mills needed to be built on the river at points where the water was fast enough to power the saws, but with access to ponds to store logs from the drive. Once finished, most of the lumber was put onto rafts and floated down the Chippewa River to the Mississippi, where it was sold in cities such as St. Louis to use out west and across the Great Plains. There was one place where 2 of Wisconsin's major logging rivers met, with natural inlets and an oxbow lake, to store all the logs coming from the Eau Claire and Chippewa rivers. It was a perfect place for mills. That place was Eau Claire. Eau Claire was poised as a trading hub between the agricultural southern part of the state and the lumbering of the north. During the logging era, Eau Claire grew from a village of less than 100 to a city of 20,000, with more lumber mills than any other place in the world. Logging was so important to Eau Claire that it was known as the Sawdust City. The lumber barons brought luxury to the city. They were moneyed and wanted all of the amenities of a real city. They built an opera house, an auditorium, and many large homes, some of which can still be seen today. Eau Claire was home to more than 30 mills during the logging era, and even had factories that produced mills. Many of the men who worked the mills during the summer were the same ones who had worked in the forest to harvest the trees all winter. Millwork was dangerous, with heavy logs rolling through giant saw blades powered by steam. A shift in the mill was 12 hours of hard, dangerous work, and permanent injury and even death were no strangers to these men. In 1852, Representative Ben Eastman told Congress
that the forest had enough lumber to supply America for all time, and in 1860 the newspaper printed, "No child born today will see the end of Chippewa lumber." The forests of Wisconsin seemed inexhaustible, but there was no regulation to stop or slow the cutting of the great pine forest. Barons would send inspectors to camps to ensure every tree was cut to maximize profits, and by 1900 the logging era in Wisconsin was drawing to a close. One by one, companies folded and mills closed. By 1910, there were less than 5 mills still in operation, and by July 15th, 1929, the last mill in Eau Claire sought its last board. This concludes our tour. If you'd like to learn more about Wisconsin's logging history or see the rest of the Paul Bunyan Logging Camp, we hope you'll visit us soon. The Wisconsin Logging Museum has been open every summer since 1936 and is located in beautiful Eau Claire, Wisconsin. For more details, please visit our website. Until next time, stay safe and keep your act sharp.